The child had his eyes. Not similar, not reminiscent, not the kind of resemblance people politely describe as a family echo. The boy standing in the settlement courtyard had Cassian Vale Morn's eyes with the precise, unsparing accuracy of a mirror held up to something he had not looked at directly in 5 years. Silver gray, deep set, carrying a quality of measured assessments that Cassian had spent 2 decades of war developing, and this 4-year-old had apparently arrived with fully formed. The boy was not frightened. That was the second thing. Most children, when a man of Cassian's particular physical dimensions and atmospheric presence walked through a gate unannounced, made some involuntary movement toward the nearest adult. This child stood his ground with both feet planted and regarded Cassian with the unhurried, calibrate silence of someone who had not yet decided whether he was a threat and was not going to be rushed into a conclusion. Between them stood Rhea, alive, 5 years older, carrying those 5 years in the set of her jaw and the precise way she had placed her body, not panicked, not theatrical, simply positioned. Herself and the wall between her son and everything behind Cassian in one seamless motion that she had clearly practiced enough times for it to be automatic. She looked at him the way you look at something you prepared for, and still were not entirely prepared for. She did not say his name. He did not say hers. From the eastern tree line, growing with the particular rhythm of horses being pushed past comfortable pace, came the sound that Cassian had been hearing in the back of his awareness since he crossed the settlement perimeter. Hoofbeats. Multiple, tactical spacing, not travelers, not his own men who were posted at the outer road. Someone had arrived before him. Someone who had known to come here before he did. Cassian looked at Rhea's face, at the way her chin lifted fractionally at the sound. Not surprise. Recognition. Specific recognition of a woman who had been calculating this possibility and just received confirmation that her calculation was correct. "How long have you known they were coming?" he asked. "Since this morning," she said. "How long have you known I was alive?" 4 days. Something moved across her face that was not quite the expression he deserved and was considerably worse for the restraint. "If you are new here, do not leave. Do not skip ahead, because the conversation that is about to happen in this courtyard is 5 years in the making, and what this child Anne does at the end of it will change everything. Stay with me." The hoofbeats reached the outer gate. Cassian did not look away from Rhea's face. He had faced war councils and enemy negotiations and the specific cold mathematics of decisions where every option had a body count. He had never once in his life felt the particular quality of reckoning that was stand in this courtyard arrived now. The reckoning of a man who had arrived too late, who had known he was arriving too late, and who was going to have to stand in the wreckage of that and be measured by a 4-year-old with his own eyes. He turned to face the gate. "Stay behind me," he said. Behind him, without hesitation, without warmth, with the flat practicality of a woman who had learned to accept tactical assistance with it meaning anything more than tactics. Rhea moved her and her son 3 steps back. The gate opened. She had always been a woman who calculated exits before she walked through entrances. Once, Rhea Vos Morn had been the kind of persons who walked into rooms without mapping them first, who trusted the architecture of her life to hold the weight she put on it, who believed that belonging to something meant being held by it in return. She had been the Alpha King's mate. She had worn that fact the way you wear something that fits, not ostentatiously, not with performance, simply as the natural condition of a body that has found its correct configuration. She had been wrong about what it meant to belong to someone. She understood this now, with the clear, unsentimental comprehension of a woman who had learned the lesson from the inside. The northern border collapse had happened on a Tuesday. She remembered this with the specific clarity that the mind reserved for the moments before everything changed. The way The light had been that morning, flat and white and cold, the way the ground had given no warning before it gave everything. The old fortification network along the Morn territory's northern edge had been deteriorating for 2 years. Everyone at court knew this. Repair requisitions had been filed, reviewed, and deferred in favor of more politically visible expenditures. Rhea had read the engineering reports and had mentioned them to Cassian twice in the months before. In the careful, measured way she had learned to raise concerns that she knew he was too occupied to act on immediately. He had said he would look into it. He had not looked into it in time. The collapse took 11 meters of fortified wall and 4 members of the survey team and Rhea, who had been conducting an independent inspection because she had stopped waiting for the official one, into a 30-foot drop onto unstable rubble. She had survived because a woman named Petra, an Omega settlement medic who had been treating the survey team's minor injuries nearby, had reached her before the secondary collapse sealed the gap. Rhea had been unconscious for 3 days. When she came back to Herf, she was in a settlement infirmary that smelled of pine resin and dried herbs, and the first thing she learned was that the border road was still impassable. The second thing she learned 2 weeks later, when her body had repaired enough itself to conduct a reliable internal inventory, was that she was pregnant. She had not made the decision to stay in a single moment. It had accumulated the way all real decisions accumulated, not as a dramatic threshold crossed, but as a series of smaller choices that eventually added up to an irrevocable direction. The road remained impassable through the first month. By the second month, Rhea had received word, through the slow and unreliable information channels available, to an Omega settlement without official pack affiliation, that she had been listed among the confirmed dead. Memorial rites had been conducted. The Alpha King had been informed. She had sat with this information for a long time. She had thought about what it would mean to send word back, to correct the record, to return to a court that had filed her death with the same administrative officials it and had administrative efficiency, and the process, presumably, begun the process of moving forward without her. She had thought about what she would be returning to, not the abstract concept of home, but the specific reality of a mate who had loved her in the distracted, intermittent way of a man for whom love was the thing he intended to do more of once the current crisis resolved, and there was always a current crisis. She had thought about the child she was carrying. She had thought about what kind of life that child would have inside a court structure that treated heirs as political instruments and mothers as the vessels that produced them. She had made her choice in the measured, unsentimental way she made all her choices, and then she had stayed. Ashridge Settlement was not glamorous. It was not supposed to be. It was a community approximately 40 Omega wolves and their families, built on land that no pack claimed and no territory governed, sustained by collective labor and mutual obligation and the particular fierce self-sufficiency of people who had learned that official protection was a variable quantity. They had taken Rhea in not because of who she was. She had introduced her only as Rhea, offering her herbalist training as her contribution, and her questions as something she was keeping to her, but because Petra had vouched for her, and Petra's vouching meant something in Ashridge. She had built a life, not a provisional life, not a life with one foot ready to leave, a real one with weight and texture, and the particular anchoring quality of things that had accumulated slowly enough to mean something. She knew every family in the settlement by name. She knew which children had recurring chest colds in winter, and which elders needed the anti-inflammatory tincture made with extra willow bark. She had delivered 2 babies and helped build one structure, and argued successfully for a better water management system that had reduced the settlement's illness rate in damp seasons, by a third. Soren had been born in the main infirmary on a winter night with Petra beside her and the settlement's midwife and no one else. He had arrived in the world with his father's eyes and his father's quality of absolute focus attention and a set of lungs that he used enthusiastically for approximately 4 minutes before apparently deciding that crying was being his dignity. He had never once cried to get something he wanted. He asked, or he waited, or he found a way to manage without. At 4 years old, he was already the kind of person who made other people feel slightly examined. Rhea had raised him to trust carefully, to observe before committing, to understand that rank insignia on a wolf's collar, not assurance, not assurance. He had learned all three with the unsettling efficiency of a child who recognized useful knowledge when he received it. The Easter egg was this. Every year, without exception, on the anniversary of the northern border collapse, a black wolf appeared at the edge of the ash ridge tree line at dusk. Enormous, dark as ink against the paler birch trunks. It sat at the perimeter of the settlement's outer boundary, never crossing, never approaching, and remained there through the night with a stillness that the settlement's wolves found both inexplicable and deeply unthreatening, which was itself inexplicable. By dawn, it was always gone. Rhea had watched it from her window the first year with the particular numbness of a woman who had not yet finished processing what the anniversary meant to her. The second year, she had watched it with the beginning of a question she was not ready to ask. By the 5th year, she watched it with settled comprehension of a woman who had filed the information carefully and drawn no conclusions she was prepared to act on. She told Soren, when he was old enough to notice and ask, that some wolves kept vigil for things they had lost. He had considered this for a long moment. Do they find them again? He had asked. Rhea had looked at the dark shape at the tree line. Sometimes, she had said, when they finally decide to look properly. Cassian had not brought a delegation. This was the first thing Rhea noticed. Not his face, not the 5 years written into the harder lines of him, not even the scar along his jaw that had not been there before. The first thing she noticed was that he had come alone. No banners, no escort, no ceremonial weight of the Alf of King's office draped around his arrival. Like a declaration, he had come the way a man comes when he is not certain of his reception and has enough self-awareness to understand that arriving with an army would be a statement he could not take back. She gave him credit for that, precisely that much and nothing more. He had appeared at the settlement's outer gate 3 hours before Keswick's men reached the eastern tree line. Though Rhea had not known about Keswick yet when Cassian arrived, only that Petra's perimeter wolves had reported unfamiliar tracks on the eastern approach that morning, and the information had settled in Rhea's chest with the cold, specific weight of a thing she had been quiet preparing for since the day she chose to stay. She had been in the courtyard when the gate opened. She had placed hers between the entrance and Soren with the automatic precision of 5 years of practice. Not a dramatic gesture, not performance, simply the body's trained response to the variable of an unknown arrival. Then she had seen his face, and the automatic precision had remained, but everything underneath it had become considerably more complicated. He looked, she searched for the honest word and found it, diminished, not physically. Physically, he was exactly what he had always been. The particular overwhelming presence of a dominant alpha who had never needed to announce him because the room always knew for he spoke us. But there was something in him that had been present before and was absent now. The way a house looks different when the fire has been out long enough for the warmth to leave the walls entirely. He had been grieving. She recognized it because she knew what it looked like on a person who processed grief by converting it entirely into function. She had done the same thing for approximately the first 8 months after the collapse, until Soren arrived and made continued self-erasure logistically impossible. Cassian had apparently had no such interruption. He stopped 6 feet from her. She watched him take her in, the same clinic inventory she was conducting on him, the same 5-year gap being measured and accounted for. His silver-gray eyes moved from her face, to the scar at her temple, to her hands, to the child standing at her left hip. He looked at Soren, and the thing that happened to Cassian's face in that moment, the thing she had been bracing for without knowing precisely what form it would take, was not what she expected. She had expected recognition. She had expected the particular shock of a man confronting an undeniable biological fact. What she had not expected was the way it broke something open him that she could see from 6 feet away. Not dramatically, not loudly, simply the visible internal collapse of a man who had been holding a structure together for 5 years and had just had the foundation assumption of that structure removed. He had not known. She had understood this intellectually. She was understanding it now in the way that felt entirely different from intellectual understanding. Watching it move through him in real time. Watching him stand in the wreckage of 5 years, of not knowing with a stillness that cost him more than anything he had shown her in the years before. His jaw tightened once. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment that had the quality of a very old conversation finally being allowed to begin. Then the bond hit her. She had managed it for 5 years with the same disciplined suppression she had applied to everything else that threatened. Her stability, pressing it down each morning as a deliberate act, the way you press a wound that has not finished closing. She had been consistent. She had been thorough. She had, she believed, reduced it to something manageable, a background frequency rather than a signal, present but not operational. Cassian was 6 feet away, and the suppression failed completely, not gradually, not with warning. The bond surfaced with 5 years of accumulated pressure behind it, and felt like something structural giving way, the physical sensation of a load, berry, element failing. A chest, deep electrical charge that moved outward through her sternum and down her arms and up through the back of her skull with an urgency that her body had apparently been storing since the last time she had been this close to him. She did not make a sound. She pressed it back down with everything she had. He felt it. She saw it in him, the same involuntary physical response moving through his body from the ground up. The stillness of a predator who has received information that overrides every other input simultaneously. His nostrils flared once. His left hand closed slowly at his side. His eyes found hers with a precision that had nothing to do with sight. Rhea, her name in his voice, for the first time in 5 years. Not a question, not a greeting. The sound of a man confirming something had not allowed him to believe until this exact moment. She said nothing. What was there to say that was not small for the occasion, or too large to manage in a courtyard with their son 3 feet away, on familiar and unfamiliar tracks on the eastern perimeter? She had rehearsed this conversation in her head for 5 years, not with hope, but with the practical preparation of a woman who knew it would eventually need to happen, and every version she had constructed had dissolved the moment she saw his face. "You should have looked sooner," she said finally. It was not everything. It was not close to everything. It was the one sentence that contained all the others, and was the only one she trusted her to deliver. Without her voice doing something she would not forgive it for. He received it without flinching, without deflecting, without the defensive restructuring that powerful men often formed reflexively when confronted with their own failures. He simply held it, let it land with its full weight, and said nothing because there was nothing available to say. That was not inadequate. That, she thought, was new. Soren had not moved. He stood at her left hip and watched Cassian with the silver-gray eyes that were his father's eyes, and the expression that was entirely his own. Measured, unhurried, conducting an assessment that he was not going to be rushed through by anyone's emotional timeline. Cassian looked at his son. Soren looked at his father. The silence between them had a texture that Rhea recognized, the specific quality of two people who were the same kind of person encountering each other for the first time, and taking the full measure of what that meant. Cassian crouched to Soren's eye level. He did not reach for the boy, did not smile with the performed warmth of an adult trying to accelerate a child's comfort. He simply brought him to the same height and waited with the patience of a man who had just understood that the most important verdict available to him today was going to be delivered by a 4-year-old, and that 4-year-old was under no obligation to deliver it on any schedule but his own. Soren studied him for a long, unhurried moment. Then he said, "Mama said some wolves keep vigil for things they lost." Cassian held his son's gaze. "She was right," he said quietly. "Did you look?" Soren asked properly. The question landed with the precision of something thrown by someone who knew exactly where the target was. Cassian was quiet for a moment that told Rhea everything she needed to know about the man he had become in 5 years. "Not soon enough," he said. "No." Soren considered this with the grave seriousness of a child processing an answer that was honest enough to be worth processing. He had not yet decided. From the eastern tree line, the hoofbeats arrived. The eastern gate opened without ceremony. 6 soldiers, crown insignia on their armor, not Cassian's personal crest, but the High Chancellor's administrative seal, which was a different thing entirely, and told Cassian everything he needed to know about the authorization chain before anyone spoke a word. They were armed for an operation, not an escort. The difference was visible in the way they spread on entry, covering angles, not forming a procession. Enforcer Brand Keswick walked in last. He was exactly what his title suggested: compact, methodical, the particular physical economy of a man who had made a profession of controlled force and had long since stopped distinguishing between the work and the person doing it. His eyes moved across the courtyard in the practiced sequence of threat, assessment, the settlement structures, the perimeter. Cassian, a pause, a recalculation, something shifting behind his expression, then Rhea, then the child. His eyes stayed on the child one beat too long. Rhea felt it. She was already moving, the same motion she had made when Cassian's gate opened, the same practiced placement of her body between Soren and the variable that had just entered the equation. But this time the motion was different in its quality. When Cassian arrived, she had positioned hers out of discipline. Now she positioned herself out of something older and colder, entirely without ambiguity. Soren pressed against her left side. He did not make a sound. Keswick looked at Cassian with the recalibrating attention of a man who had arrived expecting one set of conditions and found another. "My Lord King," level professional, the voice of someone buying time to restructure his approach. "This is unexpected." "I expect it is," Cassian said. He had not moved from the position he occupied when the gate opened. He stood in the center of the courtyard with his hands loose at his sides, and the quality of stillness that Rhea had learned in the years before meant he was not calm. He was the thing that existed on the other side of calm, where the temperature dropped and the decisions had already been made. "The High Chancellor has authorized this unit to conduct a assessment of an unregistered individual reported to be residing in this settlement." Keswick's eyes moved briefly to Rhea, and to resolve a related matter of succession documentation. Resolve. Rhea heard the word with the comprehensive understanding of a woman who had spent 5 years learned precisely what administrative language meant when it was being used to describe things that could not be named plainly in a courtyard with witnesses. "Which unregistered individual?" Cassian said. Keswick looked at him for a moment, reassessing, calculating how much Cassian knew and how much the answer to this question would reveal about how much Keswick knew. "A woman matching the description of your former." "My mate." Cassian absolute. "Say what you mean." A fraction pause. "Your mate," Kes said. "Yes." "And how long?" Cassian said, in the voice that had dropped below the command register entirely into something that had no volume because it did not need volume. "Has the High Chancellor been aware that she was alive?" The courtyard was very still. Keswick's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I am not in a position to speak to the chancellors." "How long?" The question was not loud. It was the kind of question that did not need to be loud because it was not asking for information. It already had the information and was simply giving the other party the opportunity to confirm it before the conversation moved to a place from which it could not return. Keswick looked at him. 3 years, he said, approximately. Rhea heard it. She had known, in the way that she knew things that her mind had protected her from by keeping them at the level of possibility, rather than fact. She had known that the silence had been too complete for too long to be explained entirely by the road being impassable. The road had been cleared within the first year. She had confirmed this through settlement channels. She had filed the information and not acted on it because acting on it would have required her to answer a question she had not been ready to answer. If the road was clear and no one came, what did that mean? She now understood what it meant. It meant someone had received the information and made a decision about it that served their own interests for 3 years. She built a life in a settlement and raised a child alone, and Cassian grieved with the methodical precision of a man who had been told there was nothing left to find. She did not look at Cassian. She looked at Keswick, and Keswick, who had been a professional his entire career and was not accustomed to feeling the specific discomfort of being looked at by someone who understood the full weight of what he had just confirmed, looked slightly away. Cassian released his alpha aura. No warning, no escalation, no measured deployment of authority designed to achieve a specific outcome through graduated pressure. Full release, instantaneous everything. The air changed. Not the temperature, the pressure. The specific atmospheric density of a space that had just received the full uncontained weight of the most dominant alpha in the Morn territory. 5 years of compressed grief and rage, and the particular cold fury of a man who had just learned that his mourning had been managed by someone else for their own convenience. 1 soldier went to his knees immediately. 2 more followed within 3 seconds. Not thrown, not struck, simply unable to sustain the geometry of standing upright, stones against something that operated below the level of conscious resistance. Short now. Explosive. No room between moments. Keswick held, trained, experienced. His legs were shaking and he held. The 4th soldier raised his weapon. Cassian crossed the distance in 2 strides, and the weapon was no longer relevant. 1 motion, controlled and absolute. Soldier's arm moved in a direction it was not designed to move, and he sat down with the expression of someone who had received a very clear message and intended to respect it. The 5th came from the left. Cassian turned into the charge with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before this soldier was trained, and the collision was brief and definitive. The soldier met the courtyard wall and stayed there. The 6 looked at his fallen colleagues, looked at Cassian, placed his sword on the ground with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision he intended to survive. Keswick was the last one standing. He was still standing because Cassian had left him standing. Specifically, intentionally. The way you leave one thing standing when you need it to answer questions. Cassian walked toward him, through the courtyard, past the soldiers who had resolved their conflict between training and biology in favor of the ground. Unhurried, particular pace of a man who has already decided and is simply covering the distance. Keswick held his ground. Cassian stopped 2 feet from him. "You came here," Cassian said, "to resolve a succession matter." Keswick said nothing. "You came here because Salt sent you, because Salt has known for 3 years, because Salt is managing a political arrangement that requires my mate to remain officially dead and my heir to remain officially non-existent." He tilted his head fractionally. "What were your instructions regarding the child?" The silence that followed was the kind that answered the question more completely than any words available. Cassian looked at Keswick for a long moment. Then he stepped to the side and looked past him at Rhea. She was standing exactly where she had been. Suckers. Soren pressed against her left side, her right hand resting on his shoulder, her green eyes on Cassian's face with the specific quality of a woman who had just heard something she already knew confirmed out loud and was in the process of deciding what meant for the architecture of every decision she had made since. "I am sorry," Cassian said. "Not for today." The way he said it made clear it was not for today. Not for Keswick in the courtyard or the soldiers on the ground or the aura still pressing the settlement air into different density. It was for the 3 years, for the 5 years, for the engineering report he had said he would look into, for the grief he had converted into function and called resolution. It was the beginning of an apology that was going to take considerably longer than this moment to complete. Rhea held his gaze. She said nothing. Behind her, from someone in that main building, the sound of other residents, the 40 wolves of Ashridge who had heard everything and were making the collective, quieted decision to stay out of the way until the courtyard had finished being what it was currently being. Keswick made a movement. Cassian's hand closed on his collar before the movement completed. "You are not leaving," Cassian said quietly. "You are going to stand here. You are going to think carefully about the difference between following an order and participate in what those orders were designed to accomplish. And when I am finished here, you are going to tell me everything, not what Salt told you to say, not what protects your position, everything, because the alternative is that I stopped being this measured about it." Keswick stopped moving. Soren, from his position against Rhea's side, watched all of it with the silver-gray eyes that missed nothing. He had still not decided, but he was still watching. That, Rhea understood, was more than Cassian had any right to expect today. The courtyard settled in the particular quiet of aftermath. Soldiers on the ground. Keswick standing with Cassian's hand, long on his collars, but with the quality of a man who understood that the hand who asked and could return and had decided the most available form of wisdom was stillness. The alpha aura had not fully retracted. It was still present in the air like a barometric pressure change, dense and comprehensive, the atmospheric signature of something that had been released and had not yet decided to return to containment. Cassian reached into his coat and removed the alpha seal, black metal, thumb-worn at the edge from years of use. He pressed it to his palm and spoke with the flat precision of a man issuing an order he had been building toward for longer than this morning. Longer, possibly, than he had stood until 3 minutes ago when Keswick said 3 years and the rhythmic resolved into something that could not be unfiled. High Chancellor Davin Salt is to be placed under immediate house arrest, charges to follow formal tribunal proceedings, conspiracy to obstruct royal succession, deliberate suppression of intelligence regarding living Luna, and authorization of enforcement action against a recognized heirs. A pause, the weight of the next words, measured before release. This order supersedes any council authorization currently in effect. All 7 garrison commanders receive it simultaneously. Salt receives his copy last. He put the seal away. Keswick made a sound. Cassian looked at him with the expression of a man who had already accounted for every variable in the room and found none of them requiring further engagement at this moment. "You will be transported to Crown Detention under garrison guard, not the Chancellor's facility." He held Keswick's gaze with the steady amber gray of absolute finality. "When the tribunal asks what your instructions were regarding the child, you will answer completely. Not because I am asking you to cooperate, because Salt will have already testament decisioning you as the operational decision maker, and you have 6 hours before that versions comes the document of record." Keswick looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down on the ground, not from the aura voluntarily. The movement of a man who had just run a complete calculation and arrived at the only conclusion that preserved anything worth preserving. 2 garrison soldiers, Cassian's own men, posted at the outer road and now called in, collected Keswick with the efficient economy of people who understood their instructions completely and had no questions about them. The courtyard emptied. The quiet that remained was different from the quiet before. Rhea stood where she had been standing through all of it, Soren at her left side, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her green eyes moving across the emptied courtyard with the inventory, taking focus of a woman assessing damage and determining what was still structural. Soren was looking at his father. Cassian stood in the center of the courtyard with the dispersing soldiers and the settling dust and the particular stillness of a man who had just finished doing something and had not yet moved to whatever came next. Because what came next was the thing that mattered, and he was not going to approach it with the residual momentum of everything that preceded. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he crossed to the courtyard's stone water trough, washed the blood from his left knuckle, a small cut, the only mark the encounter had left, on him, and dried his hand on his coat with the unhurried practicality of a man making him clean before something that deserved him clean. He turned to Rhea. She was watching him with the green eyes that had always seen more of him than he managed him's, and had never once pretended otherwise, and the expression on her face was not forgiveness and was not its absence. It was something more honest and more difficult than either, the face of a woman who was still in the process of deciding what the last 10 minutes meant in the context of the last 5 years, and was not going to be rushed. He crossed the courtyard and went to his knees. Not a stumble, not exhaustion. A chosen, deliberate, conscious descent, both knees on the stone and dust of an Omega settlement courtyard. Everything he was arranged into an act that had nothing to do with the Alpha King of Morn, and everything to do with the man who had told her he would look in the engineering report and had not looked into it in time. He did not reach for her hands. He looked up at her face from the ground with the silver-gray eyes that their son had inherited, and that 5 years of grief as function had done nothing to make less capable of expressing the things he had spent most of his life not expressing. "I am not apologizing for today," he said. His voice was stripped of every layer of command register. Not broken, not performed, simply honest in the way that things were honest when all the management had been used up. "Today I can account for. Today I was 4 days late, and I arrived without enough information, and there were soldiers in this courtyard who should never have been permitted to come within 100 miles of you, or Soren. I can account for today." He paused. Let that distinction land. "I am apologizing for the engineering report, for the 2 times you raised it, and the 2 times you raised it, and times I said I would look into it, and did not look into it with the urgency it required. I am apologizing for the years before, for the love that was always going to happen more fully once the current crisis resolved, and there was always a current crisis." His jaw tightened once. "I am apologizing for 5 years of grief that was also, if I am being completely honest, 5 years of not looking properly, because looking properly would have required me to believe that finding you was possible. And I had decided, with the methodical precision I apply to everything, that it was not." He stopped. The courtyard held the quality of a space in which something very heavy had just been set down. Rhea's eyes were bright, not soft bright. The brightness of someone absorbing something that was accurate and painful and insufficient all at once, which was exactly what an honest apology was supposed to be. She did not speak immediately. She was not going to make this easier than. It was by filling the silence before it was finished. Soren stepped forward. He had been standing at his mother's side through all of it, through Keswick, through the aura release, through the soldiers and the seal and the garrison orders, with the silver-gray eyes that missed nothing in the 4 year. Old's perfect instinct for the precise moment when adult proceedings had concluded and his own assessment could begin. He walked to Cassian, stopped in front of him, the same distance he had maintained since the first moment, the distance of someone who had not yet finished deciding. He looked at his father kneeling on the courtyard ground. He looked at him for a long, unhurried, entirely self-directed moment. The assessment of a child who had been raised to trust carefully and was applying that education with full rigor to the most significant variable he had ever been asked to evaluate. Then he placed both small hands on Cassian's shoulders. Not a hug. Not deliberate, considered placement of a child making decision with bodies with his or his words caught up the gesture of someone who had decided that the man in front of him had answered the question honestly, and that honesty in Soren's particular value system was the beginning of something rather than the conclusion of it. Cassian went very still, the kind of still that was not discipline. That happened when something arrived that you had not known you were waiting for, and the body needed a moment to understand it, had received it. Rhea's eyes filled. She had not cried in 5 years. She had decided, with the same cold practicality she applied to everything that threatened her stability, that crying required a safety she had not possessed, and so she had simply stopped. She had been consistent. She had been thorough. She was not consistent now. She let it come once, just this. Soren looked up at her from his position beside his father with the silver-gray eyes and the expression of a child who had made his decision and was satisfied with it. He answered properly, he said, like you said they sometimes do. Rhea looked at her son, at the man kneeling before her with both of her son's hands on his shoulders. Yes, she said, he did. They did not leave Ashridge that day. Cassian made this decision in the first hour, not announced, not discussed, simply enacted through the practical actions of a man who had recalibrated what the next several hours required and had no remaining interest in a timeline that had predated this morning. His Garrus soldiers secured the perimeter. Keswick was transported. The settlement's residents, who had remained with admirable collective discretion inside the bzing through the courtyard's proceedings, gradually reappear and were introduced to the Alpha King of Morn with the particular wariness of a community that had learned to evaluate powerful people through behavior than title. Cassian submitted to this evaluation without performance. Petra, the Omega medic, who had pulled Rhea from the rubble 5 years ago, who had been the first person to know Soren existed, who had spent 5 years being the infrastructure of everything Rhea had built here, looked at Cassian for a long, measuring moment when they were introduced. Then she looked at Rhea. Rhea gave her the smallest nod. Petra returned her attention to Cassian, who had rendered a provisional woman, who had rendered a provisional verdict and was prepared to revise it if the evidence required. She built something real here, Petra said, not as information, as a condition. I know, Cassian said. I intend to treat it accordingly. Petra studied him for another moment. Then she handed him a cup of tea and moved on. In Ashridge, this constituted acceptance. The formal recognition took place in the settlement's central courtyard as the afternoon light came through the birch trees at the western edge and laid long gold bars across the stone. Cassian stood without ceremony and read from the document he had begun drafting on the road 3 days ago when he still did not know what he would find, revised twice since this morning into something that reflected what he had found instead. Soren Vale Morn, first of his name, recognized heir to the Morn Alpha seat, crown prince and successor of record, his lineage formally entered in the territorial registry with immediate retroactive his birth, backdated to the date of birth. Every administrative record designating the Morn succession as unresolved to be struck and reissued. Then the second document. Rhea Voss Morn, recognized Luna of the Morn Pack, bonded mate to the Alpha King, her death certificate formally rescinded and declared an administered error of record. her standing in the territorial registry restored in full, with all rights and protections attendant to the lunar designation effective immediately. The 5-year gap in the official record to be accounted for in the tribunal proceedings against Salt. Not quite corrected, but publicly examined, because Rhea had asked for this specifically, and Cassian had agreed without deliberation. He did not crown her in the settlement's courtyard. That would come later in the territorial seat, with the formed traditions observed, and the formed traditions observed. What he did was take her hands over the 5 years of work written into them, over the callous and the self-sufficiency and the life she had built from components no one had provided her, and hold them with the careful attention of a man who understood was holding something he had not earned yet, and intended to spend the considerable future working to deserve. Later, he said quietly, for her alone, I am going to be considerably less composed about all of this. Rhea looked at him with the green eyes that had always seen him accurately. You have time, she said, not its refusal. The specific, measured offering of woman who had decided that time, applied correctly, was the only currency that meant anything. He received it for what it was. The people of Ashridge were not overlooked. Cassian walked the settlement that afternoon with Petra as his guide, and listened with the focused attention of a man conducting an accounting he intended to honor completely. The families who had absorbed the resource strain of an additional member without complaint. The midwife who had delivered Soren and kept his existence entirely within the settlement's walls for 4 years. The elder who had argued skillfully for reason for his permanent residency in the settlement's 3rd month, when 2 council members had raised questions about an outside with no pack documentation. Each receive former crown commendation and material recognitions calculated to make the next several years of the settlement's operation measurably more sustainable. Ashridge would receive official territorial protection, not absorption into the pack structure, which Cassian had understood without being told would not be welcome, but the specific protection of a community acknowledged by the crown as existing and mattering. Petra received this information with the expression of a woman who had been advocating for exact this outcome for 5 years, and was not going to perform surprise about receiving it. At dusk, Soren stood at the settlement's western edge, where the birch began, and watched the light go out of the sky with the patience of a child who found the event genuinely worth observing. Cassian stood beside him. They had been finding through the afternoon that they were the same kind of quiet. The quiet that did not need filling, that could exist alongside another person's quiet without requiring management. This was new information for both of them, and both of them were processing it at their own pace. The Black Wolf, Seren said, that was you. It was not a question. Cassian looked at the tree line where the birch trunks caught the last light. Yes, he said, Soren, this. Every year. Every year. But you did not come in. Cassian was quiet for a moment with the full weight of that. No, he said. I did not know yet that I was allowed to. Soren looked up at him with the silver-gray eyes. You are allowed to now, he said, with the simple declarative authority of a 4-year-old who had made a decision and saw no reason to complicate it further. Cassian looked at his son. Then he looked back at the settlement where the lights were coming on in the window, and Rhea was visible through the open door of the main building, speaking with Petra, her dark red hair catching the lamplight. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He put his hand gently on his son's shoulder, and they stood together at the tree line until Rhea came to find them. And then the 3 of them walked back inside together, through the birch light and the settling dusk, into the warmth and the noise and the ordinary here extraordinate him. Life of 5 years where High Chancellor Davin Salt is in custody tonight. His tribunal will convene within the fortnight, and the charges against him Building in the space he spent 30 years building in the space of a single public proceeding. But here is what the official record does not yet contain. Salt learned Rear was alive in year 2. He made a decision. He acted on it consistently for 3 years. What I want to know, what I cannot stop thinking about, is what happened in year 2 that made him act. He had survived year 1 of Cassian's grief without intervention. So, something changed. Something made the continuation of Rear's survival newly dangerous to whatever Salt was building. What changed in year 2? What did Salt learn, or what did Cassian do, that made a living Luna suddenly a problem that required active management? Tell me your theory in the comments. The most compelling answer shapes the next story. And if this is your first time here, like this video, share it with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The answer to year 2 is closer than you think.